This podcast is brought to you by its financial supporters on Patreon: Zach, Breck, Jed, Tom, Alex, Christine, and Jeff. Thank you for helping me to have these conversations and to create this content. Keep Talking exists to have conversations that might help to make a better society and a better culture. If we keep talking to one another, we can learn from each other, engage in good faith, remain curious, consider new perspectives, resist ideology and absolute certainty, embrace doubt, see nuance, seek the truth, change our minds, recognize our vast ignorance, and grow into better versions of ourselves. And in that spirit, I believe that each guest has important information and stories to make public, and it's something that I want to share. Steve Harrigan is a screenwriter, a journalist, and a writer for Texas Monthly. His books include The Gates of the Alamo and Big Wonderful Thing, A History of Texas. During our conversation, Steve talks about his work and the path that led him to become a full-time writer. Steve's story is one that might be helpful to aspiring writers. He details the meandering road that led to his prolific professional life. He's also one of the kindest and humblest, super talented people you will ever come across. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Steve Harrigan. All right, Stephen. Well, first, I just want to thank you for inviting me into your study and workplace and giving the time to the show. It's great to have you on, and welcome.
Well, thanks. It's good to meet you, and looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. I was thinking about the first question I wanted to ask you, and I thought to get background on you, the first question I might ask you is, who is or who was Mac?
Oh, well, Mac was my father, and who I never knew. He died in a plane crash 6 months before I was born. He was a fighter pilot in World War II, and later a flight instructor in Washington State. And so he was a kind of question mark in my life. And so I've spent a lot of time. I spent a lot of time not thinking about him most of my life because my mother remarried and I had another father. But eventually, I think that curiosity caught up with me. And to the degree that my two brothers and I went on a trek a few years back, climbed the mountain where he had died, and in Washington State, outside of Seattle. When you were a kid, and I know the curiosity did catch up with you, and you began to learn more about him. What did you know, or maybe the better question is, what little did you know? What was your impression of the man when you were growing up? Hazy. Today I think it would be so much different if somebody had died. My brother was a year old when he died. I was in utero. Yeah, and it was very, of course, traumatic for my mother and for the whole family. I think today they would understand that it's important to talk about that person a lot and to make him a presence in your children's lives. But back then there seemed to be a kind of, it wasn't a code, but it was just a kind of generic, I think this World War II generation was so stoic and so unrevealing in some ways. Yeah. And it was, I think the natural impulse was to move on. And like I said, my mother remarried. I was 5 when she married Tom Harrigan, whose name I share. And it felt rude and intrusive to ask about him in a way, because I guess as a little kid I could sense that the trauma that my mother had experienced. I had a new father. It seemed not right to bring this ghost into the conversation with him. So. It wasn't like people didn't talk about him. I mean, he came up every once in a while, and I knew I was supposed to be proud of him, and I'd seen a couple pictures of him, but that was about it. It wasn't. I think
the trauma of that incident. He had survived World War II. He had been shot down in the South Pacific and survived, and been on a raft and picked up, by a PBY in Japanese-held waters. And had shot down other pilots. And having survived all that and then dying kind of accidentally in a training mission, I just think it made it harder for my mother and the rest of my extended family to absorb that and to talk about it.
I think you noted in the article you wrote about him off course that it was a time before grief counselors.
Oh, yes, way before that, I think, yeah. And, I don't know that, I don't know what a grief counselor could have done. To sort of lessen the shock and the impact of this. I'm sure they're valuable, but it was a time before anybody would have thought of that. There had been so much grief. This was 3 years after the end of World War II. So many people were still absorbing that shock and trying to, move on from it. And I think there was a kind of quiet consensus that we don't look back and we look forward.
Over your life, and as you began to look into him more, what eventually did you learn about the man? Who was he? How does he live on in you?
I honestly don't know. I think our personalities must have been very different. Or he was very much like my older brother Jim. I think in appearance and in a kind of fearless attitude toward life. I am a total klutz at anything mechanical. I don't know I can change a light bulb barely. But, Jim, my brother, has this, mechanical ability that I think he shared with our father. There was a kind of daringness to him. He was a fighter pilot, that I've been a little bit cautiously daring at times in my life, but I think I get most of my genetic material from the other side of the family. But it would be curious to me to know what I got from him, And I've looked at a couple photographs where I sense something in me, some physical features that I share with him, but hardly. I went through my whole life sort of thinking that I had sort of one genetic parent, my mother, who I look like and who I think I share a lot of, just a lot of my basic outlook on life with.
And now you're a writer and have been for a long time.
Yeah, for a long time. Yeah.
Where did that interest come from? Do you remember as a kid having a propensity for that type of work? Talk to me about the journey to you actually making a living out of this.
Well, discovering that I liked to write and that I might be good at it and making a living at it are two separate categories. But I remember I must have been in fourth grade, fifth grade in school, and we had to write a poem, a Christmas poem. And I just noticed, I did one and I didn't think about it much, but it rhymed and it scanned and it did all the things that a poem is supposed to do. I didn't know what scans were or anything like that, but I noticed that mine was different than the rest of the class. And I had this feeling that, the feeling that you get when you discover something that you're good at.
Yeah.
It's just a sense of recognition. And I guess I must have held on to that. And I remember I started to read. I started to read seriously, or at least widely, when I was in high school. But there was always this, my parents had books in the house, and I would look at the book jackets and look at these photos of writers on the back and hold these books in my hand and just think that was a cool thing. And in high school, I remember writing a couple of essays that were praised, and that kind of, for somebody like who wasn't good at anything else, that was something I paid attention to, the fact that I might be good at this. And I had no idea how to go about that. I'd never, I was growing up in Corpus Christi, Texas. There were, my parents had met a writer once, I think, at some party. And that was really impressive to me when they came home and said, we met this guy who said he wrote a book. That's as far as it goes. But I just held on to the idea that this is something I might want to do. And, I started writing poetry, like after college when I was a yard man making a living. And then I just started to think I could, maybe I could write a magazine article. I knew I wanted to write a novel, but I didn't know how to start that. I'd never talked to a novelist. I'd seen a couple as they came through and gave lectures at UT. But I just, one day I just was pushing my lawnmower, which I did 12 hours a day practically. And your mind frees up as you're doing all this repetitive mechanical exercise. And I started to think maybe I could write a magazine article, and there's this magazine called Rolling Stone that's really popular. Maybe I could, send them something and maybe they would write me back. So I wrote a letter, which I didn't even know to call a query letter, to one of the editors at Rolling Stone with this magazine idea or this article idea. And he wrote back and said, well, yeah, send it to us. If we like it, we'll buy it. So I wrote this article, sent it to them. They liked it. They paid me $150. I was like, 22, I guess, or something. And I just declared myself a professional writer and just started writing because I'd been in Rolling Stone, which was kind of a big deal at the time. I could, get the attention of people at other smaller magazines. And around that time, Texas Monthly began, and I kind of got in on the ground floor of writing for them around 1973 or so. So I just, from then on, I was just, I was making like $2,000 a year, but I was surviving. And I was, working on a novel at the time and writing magazine pieces.
I'm interested in the recognition of talent generally and specific to your realization that, damn, maybe this is something I'm good at. How did you know this was an area of life in which you had some talent, and how much would you attribute it to natural ability and work?
For me, it was the course of least resistance.
Yeah.
If I had aspired to be a concert pianist, it would have been all work.
Yeah.
With no outcome.
Yeah. Yeah.
But the pleasure of writing and of hearing yourself described as a good writer was kind of a drug, and it created a self-image that I wanted to live up to. And so the work came later in a way. It was hard work, but I knew that the work was worth it because I did have this bent toward writing. It was something, that, if you're a football player and you can throw a good pass or you can, run fast, you know that.
Yeah.
It doesn't make you a better person.
Yeah.
But you know that you're going to if you put in the work, you can improve and you can maybe be somebody good at it. And that was the way I felt about writing.
Did you need somebody to tell you that, or do you think intuitively you understood that you had this gift, this ability that was just a talent that not everybody possesses?
I think I intuitively understood that. There was nobody really except my mother to tell me that. She encouraged me. She recognized it. But, she wasn't an editor. She didn't know exactly what I was aiming for. And there were no like mentors or anybody like that hanging around. I just kind of, I was kind of shy about it. I wouldn't have talked to anybody about it much. It felt presumptuous and, kind of weird. So it was kind of a secret, for me. I knew that my parents valued writing, because they did have books in their house. And I knew that writers held a certain level of esteem in their imagination. So maybe in some ways I was trying to impress them. But I think mostly I just kind of was listening to that impulse I had that this could be something I could do.
Yeah. What was the Rolling Stone article about, and how did you come up with it?
It was this was like 1972, I guess, and I was living in Austin. I was going to like the Armadillo World headquarters, listening to music and stuff like that, like everybody did. And I was just aware of the fact that the armadillo, the animal, had become this sort of totem of Austin. It seemed to embody the Austin of that time. And it was kind of a shy, persistent little animal, that hardly nobody ever noticed. And, there was a guy named Jim Franklin who was an artist, and he's still around. He was an artist who painted all these great posters and murals depicting armadillos as a kind of, spirit of Austin, for want of a better phrase. And so I thought that would be an interesting story, how this city had sort of identified itself with this homely little creature. And that's what I did. I went and interviewed Jim Franklin where he lived at the Armadillo World headquarters. And I had never interviewed anybody before, or seen anybody being interviewed. I didn't know what I was doing, but I just did what I could. And then I wrote this piece and sent it to them. And I was shocked when they wrote back and said they wanted to use it.
That has to be an amazing moment where you realize that something that you may have done just for fun can potentially be turned into something that can help you support yourself in life. The journey from that first income, the first paycheck from doing something you enjoyed doing and writing that piece. Talk to me about that journey from that moment to a conclusion by you that this is now me. I have steady work. I have the ability to be able to consistently support myself doing my craft.
Well, I consistently is a aspirational term, but I did manage to support myself and our family doing that. But it was a long rocky time because at the beginning, no harm, no foul, $150, which I was paid for that Rolling Stone piece. My rent was $100. So I was good for that month. And I could buy food and everything, and I could still mow yards a little bit, but I could combine writing magazine pieces and mowing yards. I did that for about a year, and then I realized I can make a living at this, a small living, but enough of a living to pay the rent and get by. And I didn't have any dreams beyond being able to pay my rent and write the next thing. There was no, I'd like to have a nice house. I'd like to travel in Europe. I'd like to, have a nice car. None of that ever occurred to me. What I wanted was to be able to support myself as a writer. And so as a result, my financial horizons were pretty low. And I was able to get by on, I don't know, $2,000 a year, whatever it was.
Did you have any writers that you had looked up to and that you knew about their career, you knew their writing styles, and you thought to yourself, this is a North Star for me professionally, or were you kind of really just doing this on the fly?
Well, I developed those, an understanding of other writers that I might want to emulate, or at least it might want to seem like.
Yeah.
At first, no. I mean, in high school, I was, when I first started reading for real, what I discovered that I liked the best to read were just kind of big, fat novels, historical novels in particular. I remember reading all of Kenneth Roberts' work. I don't know if you ever heard of him, but he was a big deal in like the 30s and 40s. He wrote all these books like Northwest Passage that were about the American Revolution. And for some reason, it wasn't I'm not sure it was the writing itself or the books itself, but the grappling with the past and sort of bringing the past to life really, really inspired me. I read I didn't differentiate between literature and popular fiction. I still don't very much. So, I'd read, Hemingway, of course, was a huge, kind of bedazzling, I wouldn't say model but an inspiration. Like how can you distill writing down to that, beautifully, pristine, very, very minimal sentence or observation, and have it, expand your awareness in a way that it did. So there were people like that, but there was never any one writer that I really thought, oh, that's who I want to be.
Yeah.
And I've noticed that I've taught writing for a long time at the Michener Center for Writers at UT, and I've noticed a lot of students almost very, very consciously are trying to replicate other writers, and I don't know if they are aware of how. I mean, it's a universal thing. I'm sure I did it as well, but I don't know if I did it as consciously as I thought they might have been doing it. Almost they're like exercises in a way, to try to. There was a period where all the students were writing Cormac McCarthy kind of stuff, and then another period where they're all writing like George Saunders, and so I mean, I think it's important as a young writer to kind of study and emulate people, but I never had that specific goal in mind of like being the next Hemingway or Faulkner or anything like that.
So you knew you had a talent. You knew the feedback you were getting, at least at the beginning, was positive. Did you seek additional feedback? Did you take classes? Were there things that you did to hone your craft and try to improve at that point in your career?
Yeah, there were at UT where I took I didn't know that that you could really study creative writing.
Yeah.
I mean, I was an English major. I majored in English because I thought that's what you did if you wanted to be a writer. I was dead wrong about that, I think, because most of it seemed to be kind of academically directed toward analysis and that kind of thing. I wasn't interested in that at all. But I did take a couple creative writing classes. There were only a couple, one in poetry and one in short stories. And I wasn't really interested in writing short stories for some reason. So really there wasn't much for me to do in those classes. It didn't, it wasn't, there were like, as I recall, 30 people in the class or something. It wasn't like an intensive workshop with only a few people, and I even having been in at the Michener Center, for 20 years or so, I kind of taught on and off there. I realized I was an okay teacher, but I would have been a very poor student because I didn't want anybody else talking about my work.
Yeah,
I kind of knew what I wanted to do. I'm sure that any criticisms anybody made of me would have been valid, but they might have been crushing, and they might have been demoralizing. And so I don't think the idea of again, it was a kind of secret. I worked on it in private, and I remember after finishing my first novel and having it published, it was a little bit of a shock to realize that other people were going to read it. It's just like it didn't quite occur to me that it was sort of open for discussion.
It sounds like it was very personal for you, that the writing and the work, it was something almost like a deal you made with yourself, or it was in something very deep within you that was driving you to create this art.
Well, I think that's true for anybody who does any form of art or craft or whatever. I mean, it is personal because it's who you are.
Yeah.
And you create this identity, or you discover this identity, and your choices are either to affirm it or to let it go.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of a I'm kind of a sticky personality that way. When something sits right with me, I kind of stay with it. And so yeah, I mean, I think it's true with writing or music or anything. It's you're not just, it's not just a hobby. I mean, it can be a hobby, and maybe in many cases it should be a hobby. But if you identify with it so strongly, as I did and other people do, then it's who you are, and you don't have much room to move from that.
Do you regard it as a calling?
I don't want to say that. I think the word calling from my Catholic education has too much
baggage.
Yeah. I mean, it's not God calling you. Yeah. It's like, it's just a discovery of another aspect of yourself that you might not have known was there. I mean, it's not, a lot of my life has been trying to play down the high-toned expectations that people have of writers, or authors. And I don't like that. I don't like the idea that it's more valuable or more worthy or more important than any other occupation. So there's an air of mystery, I think, about any craft or art that you don't quite understand how somebody does it, you know. But I think we can kind of, if somebody is a carpenter, which is extremely mysterious to me, how you could build a house. Yeah. I don't think that person would think of themselves as having a calling. They're just good at it and they like it, or they make money at it or whatever. And I kind of feel like that's the same with writing or any other art or craft.
Yeah. I'm in my mid-30s now, and I have friends of mine that are kind of at this point where they may have been doing a job that in no way speaks to them for the past decade, and they've been doing it almost exclusively for financial reasons. And I get the sense that there is, and I identify with this to some degree, that when you're in that place, there is a bit of a feeling of being adrift and not really being in touch with something deeper in yourself that may point you in a direction that would be more fulfilling, a more fulfilling way to spend your time. You spoke to this a little bit just a minute ago about how you either, if you do identify with something very strongly, you either kind of honor that and decide to pursue it, or you don't. If I'm phrasing that relatively correctly in terms of how you think about that idea, how were you able to honor that and to nurture it in your own life and dedicate yourself to it?
Well, I don't know that there was much of a choice for me. I mean, I knew that your friends that you're talking about who are in jobs that don't call to them, they're just, and there's nothing wrong with that. Yeah. But I just knew that I didn't want that. I didn't want an unfulfilling job. I didn't want that for my life. I wanted to pursue the thing that meant the most to me and that seemed to give the most to me. And when I thought of other jobs I could do, I was just dispirited. I wanted to be happy, and I wanted to do the thing that I wanted to do, and I was willing. I don't think I was consciously willing to give up stuff for it. It just never occurred to me to want those other things more than I wanted this. Yeah. So, I was happy with not making a lot of money or very much money at all. Again, if I could pay my bills, that was just fine.
And then you go to Texas Monthly, right? At some point in your career. Mm-hmm. Talk to me about that area, that period of your life between the first article and getting on staff with that publication, and what the work was like for you, maybe at the beginning and related to Texas Monthly specifically.
Well, the interesting thing about Texas Monthly was that nobody knew what they were doing. And, this was the Texas Monthly was the dream of Mike Levy, the publisher, who had this idea that, there were things called city magazines in other parts of the country, like Philadelphia Magazine. And he had the idea that Texas was a coherent enough place that it could support a state magazine. And he was right. And he hired people like Bill Broyles and Greg Curtis, who are all of those guys are good friends of mine. And they started this magazine, and Bill had never edited a magazine. Bill was the editor-in-chief at that point. Greg was the I don't know what his senior editor or something like that. None of them had ever done any of this work. I'd written like 1 or 2, 3 magazine articles. I still didn't know how to write a magazine article. Yeah. And I was, for most of that time, for most of the first few years, I was a freelance writer. I joined the staff in, I think, 1980 for about 10 years. But I just threw myself into it. And I told them, here's a story I'd like to write. Here's another story I'd like to write. They'd come to me and say, what about this story? Would you like to do that? And I just taught myself how to do it. I'd never studied journalism. I'd never taken courses in it. I didn't know how to take notes. I didn't know anything. Yeah. But, that was how I taught myself. And, it was kind of agony at first trying to figure out how to, not just how to get the information that I needed, but how to structure the magazine story, how to write it in a way that was interesting. And, I banged my head against the wall many, many sleepless nights trying to figure out how to do this. But eventually I began to understand that I kind of had a grip on it. I had sort of my own voice. I had sort of my own interests. And it became, I wouldn't say easier, but it became, I felt like less of a fraud the more I did it.
It sounds like it was extremely difficult at the beginning. What did you learn, maybe the big hacks or the big processes that you discovered over probably a lot of trial and error, I would imagine, over the years of writing these pieces that really helped you to hone the craft, to become a better writer, to be able to produce these articles?
Well, the main thing for me was to get the information. I was more of a stylist than I was a reporter. I came into this with guns blazing, thinking I was going to write this immortal prose, about some, lame event or something. And so I was putting the cart before the horse. I was thinking too much about the writing and not doing the work of really getting the information I needed, not interviewing enough people, not doing enough reading, not going on enough reporting trips. And I realized, it took me a while to realize that when, those sleepless nights I was talking about when I was banging my head against the wall, the reason I was doing that, I guess I mean, some people would call that writer's block or something. I would just call it frustration. Yeah. And it was because I didn't know enough. I thought that I had reported the story, but I hadn't really. And I should have called this person back again and again. I should have gone to that place again and gotten more information, gotten more, sort of color commentary about what was going on. And so it was a long-term course in humility, that this is, okay, Mr. Smarty Pants writer, this is not about writing. This is about, talking to the reader, making sure, being honestly reporting and honestly, writing a story that would engage a reader and make what you're talking about clear to that reader, and rather than obfuscate it with a bunch of kind of smarty pants prose. So that took me a while, and it's still something I'm working on. Even I'm not a natural born reporter. You know, I have lots of friends who are. To me, the hardest moments in writing journalism were getting over my shyness to pick up the phone and call somebody, or to, I had this there was a image of myself as somebody who thought he couldn't do this for some reason. I was just not. I'm not as shy as I used to be, but I was pretty shy, and I didn't pursue it aggressively enough. And I think that aggression is one of the keys to a really good reporter, and I just don't have it.
Yeah,
I do have, and also I'm much more at home, sort of sitting by myself. Say I'm writing about some subject, some place. I'm much more at home, standing there all by myself, thinking and taking notes, than I am interviewing somebody.
Yeah.
When I think a real reporter is somebody who's much more at home, just plunging into it, talking to as many people as possible.
Yeah.
Mixing it up. I'm just not that person.
You said earlier that one of the decision points, or one of the reasons why you stuck with writing, was that you wanted to be happy. You wanted to do work that was meaningful. As we're talking about, especially these early years, but I would imagine this continues throughout your career, it's frustration. There's a lot of frustration. There's a lot of work that goes into it. That doesn't always sound like a blissful experience. So what was it that continued to make you want to do the work, even though it wasn't always blissful? Is it the difference between happiness and meaning, that you found the work very meaningful to you? I guess I'm thinking about people out there who are listening to this conversation who feel like they have something that a craft that they really want to dedicate themselves to, but are under this Disney-esque notion that it's supposed to be all fun all the time. How do you think about that as it applies to your career in writing?
Well, it's certainly not all fun all the time, and it's the end result that's fun at first. It's like seeing your name in print, or getting a copy of your first book. And to me, the evolution that has to happen is the fun has to be in the process of writing. I mean, at some point, seeing your name in print isn't going to be enough. You have to take satisfaction from the actual process. And you can have a very frustrating day of writing, which happens almost every day. Yeah. But you turn a phrase, or you kind of nail a sentence, and you think, that's a rush. Yeah. That's exciting. When you're talking about the last book I wrote had like 320,000 words in it. 320,000 words, something like that. Huge book, physically. But so that's an endless journey. But along that way, you'll write a sentence, or you'll make a metaphor or an observation that you just think, wow, this makes it worth it. And it's a tiny little fragment of that. It's like 6 words out of that 320,000. Yeah. But it confirms that you're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And it's those little moments of excitement and thrill that are very unique to you and secret to you.
Yeah.
That make you want to keep going.
And it sounds like I loved how you put this earlier, that these external expectations and how that can mess with the writing process. It seems like this was an inner journey largely for you. It was personally meaningful. Yes, you liked having other people be able, I would imagine, to see your name in print and be able to read your material, but it spoke to something in you.
Oh yeah. It's back to that self-identity. It shored up that self-identity and made me as a person less diffuse. Yeah. I had a sense of who I was. I was on an errand, if not a mission, if not a calling. Yeah. I had an agenda, and it sharpens your life. It gives you a purpose, and I think that's true. It's much more fun, for instance, if you're going on a trip somewhere, to have a goal in mind, to like learn. You want to learn something or see some specific thing rather than just go on this goalless, trip. And so it's the same kind of thing. It's like you channel your awareness into a tighter, sluice in a way, and you're more alive that way somehow. You're moving faster. You're moving more directly.
Feeling like you're growing in some way.
And that you're going somewhere.
Yeah. I'm always curious about people who have a craft like you. We're sitting in your study, which I immediately identified with and would love to have one of these at some point in my life, because I could happily, I have a very strong introverted side to me as well that just loves books and quiet and private work. And I aspire to having something similar to this at one point in my life. When you were a reporter, let's say, for example, or when you're writing a book, what does a great working day look like to you?
It starts with having nothing on the calendar. If I've got to go to lunch with somebody back in the pre-pandemic days, or if I had a dentist appointment, it kind of, if there's something nagging at me that I got to do, it in a way it's good because it helps you structure the day. But my most blissful days as a writer are those days when I can sit down in my office and realize all I got to do today is write. And it might not be any fun. It might not go well, but I've got the whole day to mess around, and that feels really good. And if I can write, I'm not one of those people who sets themselves a goal of like 2 pages or X number of words per day. But if I can write well, if I can, make a paragraph work, I feel like, wow, that was a good day. And if I have a bad day where nothing seems to be going well, I know from experience that if I come back the next day and read over what I've written, it'll be better than I thought. And so, one of the things you learn as a writer is that your moods have not much to do with it. Whether it was easy to write or hard to write, it's kind of the same thing. When you read it over, it's like, well, that was hard work, or I didn't think I'd got that, but I actually did. Or if I didn't get it, I know now how to get it. I see by how doing it wrong, I can do it right. And so to me, one of the most important things to realize is no work is ever wasted. Everything you write, every minute you put in trying to write is progress. And that's sometimes hard to grasp when you're feeling despair.
Yeah. Let's say you do have a day where there's no dentist appointment, there's no meeting. You have it's a Tuesday and you have nothing on your calendar except whatever you want to explore and write. Do you have a consistent time you get up, a time you go for a walk, a time you have dinner in your house? What is a day, if there are any consistent habits, look like from that perspective? I get up about 6, usually about between 6:30 and 7. I typically in the morning I will go for a 4-mile walk, something like that. Listen to a podcast or a book while I'm walking, or I might I just got a rowing machine during the pandemic, or I might do 30 or 40 minutes on the rowing machine. Have breakfast. Read the paper. That takes, by roughly 9 o'clock, I'm out in my office looking at my watch to see if it's time for lunch yet. And on a typical day, I'll do, a typical day, to be honest, another hour or so of email and stuff like that, and fooling around, and then I'll sort of start to get down to work. It'll take me, and then if I can get anything at all done, I will have earned the right to go have lunch
in my house, and typical. Yeah, we're talking pandemic lifestyle now. It's like I usually have lunch at home, go back out to work. Often, we have stuff to do with our grandkids or kids, and so there might be kids, kids over at the house, and we usually eat on the early side, 5:30 or 6, and then if I'm really going on a book or a piece of writing, I might slip out back to my office for another hour or two. But we might as well. We usually I might read, but mostly watch TV after that. And so that's kind of my day.
Yeah. Am I right? You're the father of three?
Father of three girls.
Father of three girls. I have wondered, I don't have kids at this point in my life, and I so identify with your description of what an ideal day looks like, because I just love that. It brings me just a lot of inner calmness and peace and inner exploration of exploring ideas and books and journaling and writing. And I always like to also get outside. How raising a family is also, I'm sure, both a joy and a lot of work too. How were you able to manage both being a craftsman, an artist, a writer, while also engaging in that and trying to be a good dad? I guess I'm really curious around like the time and energy allocation. If you felt like for a while, your writing was just not going to be a bit secondary to your family. How did you think through that, maybe before you had kids and during it?
We never thought through it. So, we should have probably thought, how are we going to make this work? But, you throw yourself in and then you make it work. And in our case, my wife made the decision, that she wanted to be a stay-at-home mom, which meant I had to step up and really actually make money to support. I ended up supporting 5 people on a freelance writer's income, which was sometimes it was kind of an adventure a lot of the times. We take vacations, but they would always be tied to a travel article I was writing where somebody was paying the bills and stuff like that. But what happened? The great thing about her decision to do that was that she. It's kind of a 50s marriage in a way, 1950s. She does the housework. And I did a lot of the carpooling and stuff like that. She did most of that. But I was here, unless I was out of town, which I would do, frequently, but be gone. I tried to be gone no more than like 2 or 3 days. So, I was around all day. For the most part. And, we had dinner every night. She cooked. We ate. And it was challenging because, we had 3 young children who needed our attention. And, when you're in the middle of a big project, as a writer, your mind is just filled with that. So I was, I could say I was a little bit distracted at times, but I don't think I ever missed a soccer game or a play or a band concert or anything like that, unless I was really, out of town for, and I couldn't get back. But I was, it was just all a package. I wrote at home. We were sitting out in an office in my backyard now, but when the girls were young, and my office was like right in the middle. It wasn't an office. It was just a, like kind of a, like a closet almost off our bedroom. And so I was in the middle of the house listening to everything going on, trying to focus. And, but it was great, but it's a challenge, I think, for anybody to raise children and to do it well and to be attentive. And it's not more of a challenge for a writer, but I think your headspace is taken up quite a bit. You don't come home at the end of the day, because I was home already. And I, there's no cutoff valve for your thoughts about, how can I fix that? Or what's the next chapter going to be like? It's just all swirling in your head all the time. So it's, I was sometimes absent-minded, I guess, to an objective observer. But I was doing my best.
Do you think it helped you? It helped you focus on the work, having that kind of responsibility, and like you said, I mean, it was time for you to really step up with your, I'm sure, productivity and workload. Do you think it helped you in some way to focus you and to get the best out of you?
Well, without a doubt, for one thing, it raised the stakes.
Yeah, right.
Not just the financial stakes, but I had something to write about. I had something to care about. I mean, it wasn't just me, and it was. It focused me. It reoriented my thinking about what was important. As much as I cared about my job and my books and my articles and my screenplays, I cared more about my family. You know, and that's in a really good way, a destabilizing revelation.
Yeah.
When you're just by yourself and you've got your own person self to take care of. It just made me, by many degrees, it made me more aware of the world, more aware of other people, made me feel more responsible for what I was doing, and it made me question what I was doing more. So, I think it was a crucial. I mean, for me, without having a family, I'm not sure. Even though I would have had more time to be a writer, I'm not sure I would have been as productive a writer or would have been as worthwhile a writer.
Well, the most recent book that I want to talk to you about, which I saw earlier, The Big Wonderful Thing, is a bit of a tome. I think you said the number earlier was something like 320,000 words related to that book. How did the idea for this massive project start in the first place?
Not with me. It started with Dave Hamrick, who was the director of UT Press at the time, and he decided that Texas needed a new all soup to nuts history of itself, and thought that I was one person who might consider wanting to do that. And I shied away from that idea for a long time. He kept coming back to me and asking. I kept saying no. But it finally it wasn't that he wore me down, but I kind of wore myself down in saying no. I've lived here most of my life. I've lived through a lot of Texas history. I've worked through a lot of Texas history in some of the articles I've written for Texas Monthly. And it felt ultimately like, boy, this is an impossible challenge, but could be really rewarding and interesting. And so I finally said yes. And there were no restrictions. Dave didn't say it has to be this long. It has to do this. It's just, my instructions were write a history of Texas. And so that's what I did. And it took about 6 years. But it was a really interesting process. I learned a lot about Texas, obviously, but I also learned a lot about how to write a book like this. And again, it was on-the-job training. I was teaching myself, by trial and error. But it ultimately became a lot of fun.
Yeah, I told you this before the interview that I grew up in northwestern Pennsylvania, and at least one of my brothers was shocked when I decided to move to Texas from living in California for almost 10 years. When I was a kid, we used to watch Walker, Texas Ranger. And I think there is this throughout America, this idea that is linked, that has linked John Wayne movies to Texas, sort of a cowboy culture. There's a lot more, just in having lived here for 3 years and exploring the state and reading a bit about the history. It's obviously a far more complicated, detailed story. When people ask you a simple question like, what is the history of Texas? Or how do you describe this place? Maybe beginning at the beginning of the book and where you explored the state in the beginning of Big Wonderful Thing.
Well, there's no easy answer to what this state is. It's, now I think the latest census says we're 29 million something people. Those are like 29 million individuals. And, there have been, the history of Texas goes back, if you want to include prehistory, which should, probably at least 15,000 years. So that's a lot of people, a lot of places. And, Texas is not it's not that defined a thing. I mean, it's our borders were only fixed in like 1850. So, but what holds it together as a concept, I think, is the fact that it was an independent nation for 10 years and a nation that was embattled, constantly at war with Mexico, constantly fighting with Native Americans, trying to expand, trying to conquer. There's this sort of this identity that was forged during that time as self-reliance and independence that is not true of everyone in the state now or ever, but it seems to be a kind of general idea that Texans have of themselves. And, it's still current. And, you may have, somebody like you who moved here from California 3 years ago, you can't help but notice that mojo is working here, you may resist it, you may embrace it, but it's there. I mean, this very emphatic sense of place and of identity that, is I think stronger than in other places. And maybe because we're such a much more spread out, bigger place, but I think we have a more congealed history in a way. We have a kind of in stories like the Alamo and stuff, we have a kind of birth story, and not all that many places have that people hang on to so strongly and argue about so vehemently.
You mentioned that it was a 6-year journey to write that book and to do all of the research, and I have to imagine that the people who suggested that you write this book knew that you were damn well qualified to explore this and to spend a lot of your energy and time writing a book like that. Given how much you had already known about the state prior to doing the research for the book, what surprised you during that journey, during that research, that still resonates for you about the state?
Well, I think one thing that's, I don't know if it's surprising, but kind of just interesting is how odd it is that it still thinks of itself as one place. Because, we have, I think it's like, I can't remember now, 250,000 square miles of Texas. And, we've got coastlines, we've got seacoasts, we've got forests, deep, thick forests, we've got open prairie, deserts, mountains. I mean, it's a vast landscape, a very varied landscape. And it's been peopled with people who have been at war with each other in one way or another for, as far back as you can go. And yet there is this coherent sense of what a Texan is that still lingers. It seems like this place should have split apart into different identities, into different factions, into different states, many years ago, and yet it wants to hold itself together. And I think that, that cohesive identity, in spite of all the divisive qualities of the landscape and of the people, is something really interesting and surprising.
I know one of the things that surprised me when I moved here was just the utter diversity of the state, and how in a lot of the cities that I have explored since being here, there are often, this is a place of refuge for immigrants, for refugees. There's a degree of sort of mixing among Texans that I found surprising, ethnically and culturally as well. the Texas that we are now living in, I think we just added a few congressional seats recently within the past week or so. It strikes me, I've read Larry Wright's book, God Save Texas, which I know is dedicated to you, if I remember correctly. And he was speaking about what is projected to happen in the state in this century and how it really is a reflection of the country. And sort of as Texas will go, so will go the country politically and culturally. How do you, given the trends, given what you know about modern Texas, how do you see this state evolving and changing and influencing America over the next century?
One of the funny things about having written a book of history is that people keep asking you to predict the future.
How's that going?
I'm not that good an historian. I'm barely an historian. I'm a guy who took on the task of writing a history, but I don't have any confidence in projecting where we're going. I mean, I think Texas, yes, it is emblematic of the rest of the United States. I mean, it is that perfect purpling state that may go blue, that may stay red. There's a continual admixture of people and philosophies that are changing it. I mean, I do think it is. I just think it's interesting that. I think I told this to Larry, but when he was writing his book, God Save Texas, you look at the map of the United States and everything funnels down to Texas. It's like the ballast in the hold of the ship, and it's just going to draw people here. It's going to be a representative of everything that's happening in the country. I mean, I'm so fascinated, like what's happening at the Alamo right now. I don't know if you've followed this, but there is a very contentious fight about how to spruce up the Alamo to make it more of an historical site, and rather than just a kind of a tourist attraction. And there's all these people in various political and cultural stakeholders who are trying to grab control of the narrative of what the Alamo is. And that is, you look at everything that's happening in the country right now with, this reassessment of what we are as a country, who we are, Confederate monuments coming down, there's racial justice being like at the forefront of everything. And you look at the Alamo, and that is, I mean, there's no more perfect example of people fighting over the meaning of a place and the meaning of our history than what's happening at the Alamo right now. And so I think whether we'll continue to, whether we lead the rest of the country in these in terms of the weather, the kind of political and cultural weather that's going on, or whether we're just emblematic of that in the future, I think Texas is going to be a huge player. I mean, it's a gigantic state. It's a gigantic accumulation of people. It can't not be a power player.
Yeah. What is the fight about related to the Alamo, and how do you view its application to the rest of the country?
Well, it's a proxy political battle, I think, ultimately, when you distill it down, between the far right, represented by people like Dan Patrick, the lieutenant governor, and what I don't know if you want to, what terms you want to use, but people who want to put the story of the Alamo in the context of, in a larger context of Spanish colonial history, of slavery, of civil rights, because in the Woolworth's department store that's on the western edge of the Alamo compound was one of the primary places in San Antonio that was desegregated, where there was a sit-in there. So there are people who want to isolate the idea of the Alamo as being only the center of a battle for freedom, against tyranny. And then there are the people who are saying, hey, wait a minute, there's a broader story, a more troublesome story, with deep roots in our culture and indications for where we're going. And so I'm not saying anybody is right or wrong exactly. It's up for grabs, but the fact that it's up for grabs, to me is just representative of how the whole notion of what the United States is, who we are, that's also up for grabs. And we've fought this vicious culture war in the last, certainly in the last 4 years. It's continuing, after Trump's defeat. But it's not going to go away. I mean, we saw what happened on January 6th, and there is, that is stirring everywhere. And, this raging debate, if you could call it that, over what America is. And I think you can, I think the Alamo is a perfect place to study that.
Yeah. I know this is another thing that Larry talked about a lot in his book, was the difference between the Texas of his youth and the Texas that he found now, and has found as an adult. And that, I think earlier in his life, he was mentioning this was not a place he ever wanted to come back to. And then he had an experience around the Austin area, I think in the 80s, where he wanted to come back and be here. You have spent a lot of your life also in Texas, and kind of as we begin to kind of wind the conversation down, I'd love to, maybe in closing on the subject of Texas, get your personal experience and observations about how the state has changed in your lifetime and your experience.
Yeah, it's so many ways. I mean, when I was a kid, it was just, it felt like a smaller place, even though it's always bragged about being such a big place. Yeah. I mean, it was, it felt more rural. It felt more distant. Even though I was living in cities like Abilene and Corpus Christi and Austin, it felt not urban. If not, it didn't feel rural, but it felt not urban. It didn't feel like these were cities. Yeah. I never lived in a big city like Dallas or Houston. It felt distant. It felt it didn't feel like we were part of the United States in a lot of ways. I mean, the United States felt like something outside our borders. It was partly that's geographical. I mean, if you grow up like as I did in Corpus Christi, you're much closer to Mexico than you are to the rest of the United States. And so there was this sense of, of isolation. And, there was when I was a kid, when I was in college, even a little few years later, there was no national newspaper. There was you couldn't subscribe. I mean, I guess people could subscribe to the New York Times, or the Washington Post, but Wall Street Journal, but I never saw them, and so there was your local newspaper. There was your local TV station that had news for 15 minutes every day. And you didn't feel in any particular way connected to the rest of the country. That has changed. Texas has muscled its way into the middle of the country, into the center of the conversation, and it's partly that's a result of economic development, and population development and stuff like that. But it also is just a larger awareness of the rest of the world has come to us, or we've brought it to ourselves. So I feel like I guess the main thing I feel compared to when I was a kid is more connected to the world. Texas is not. Texas is defiant still. It doesn't want to be part of the United States. Not really. It wants to be its own thing, but it is. It's made itself a player on the national stage that it wasn't quite in the same way before. I mean, it was, of course we had Lyndon Johnson and Sam Rayburn and John Nance Garner, all these people who are making Texas a player on the national stage. But I think the rest of the country resented Texas without respecting it. I think they kind of realize they have to respect it now because it's just too big a place.
Yeah. Yeah. The last topic I want to explore with you is kind of directed for creative types that might be listening to this. And we talked about your early writing career and you noticing a talent or some sort of inner compass about wanting to pursue your craft. And I feel like there are a lot of people out there who have that impulse and don't know what to do with it. Don't see an economic future for what they feel like they really want to do with their energy and their time. One of the things that struck me in you as you were telling your story was it seemed like you had very low expectations in terms of money that you would make. You didn't sound like you were particularly interested in owning a lot of stuff, that really it was the work itself that was meaningful to you and that you were willing to adapt. I'm projecting a little bit, and so you can tell me if I'm off base. What advice would you give someone who has an artistic bent and is worried about the financial side of life, in terms of what to do when, taking them back to maybe at the time when you were cutting grass and you were 22 or 23 years old? What advice would you give, a writer, a podcaster, an artist of some kind, for how to think about the future, what steps they might want to consider about what to do with their gift or their interest that they want to pursue?
Well, I think it's a mistake to assume that if I'm going to be a writer or if I'm going to be whatever, I have to make a living at it.
Yeah.
I think that is a big weight to put on yourself.
Yeah, sure.
And, nothing wrong with having a job.
Yeah.
I think even a job that you don't really connect to, when you're doing it every day, you're growing in it every day, you're gaining respect among your colleagues, you begin to create a sense of self-worth.
Yeah.
And I think self-worth is what feeds your life as an artist. And so let's say you're managing a bowling alley and you're working there 8 hours a day, but you've got 2 hours on the weekend to write a novel. Use those 2 hours to write the novel. You don't have to do it all day, every day.
Yeah. And
you can think of it as a hobby. You can think of it as a passion. You can think of it as whatever you want. But if you enjoy doing it, if you enjoy having done it, if you enjoy struggling with it and trying to come out the other side of a project, there's no rule that says you have to make a living at it.
Yeah.
And I just think people put too much on themselves, particularly with writing. I think, I think because writing is so closely connected to identity. It's like it's a statement of who you are,
yeah.
and a very obvious statement. Whereas if you want to play, I know plenty of people who are recreational piano players or guitar players. They don't hate themselves for not making a living at it. They enjoy it.
Yeah.
And that's the same with writing. I mean, it's just, you can enjoy it and just get what you can out of it. If it turns out you can make money at it and you can adjust your economic life where that can fill more of your of your day, that's great. But if the tragic thing would be a gift that is forever untouched.
Yeah.
And I think that's what really would I could have had. I mean, if I had done something else in my life and I'd done that and not written, I would feel empty.
Yeah.
But had I done, had a full-time job and wrote in the margins, I think I'd still feel satisfied.
Yeah. I want to, in closing, just thank you for all of the topics we've discussed, and more so just for your time. I know you're a busy guy and your work is prolific, and I just appreciate the hospitality of you allowing me into your home and into your office and getting to pester you with all these silly questions that I have for you. So, in closing, I just want to express some gratitude for the work you do and the life you've lived, and how productive you have been, and especially for today's conversation. It was really great to meet you.
Well, it was really fun for me, Dan. Thanks for inviting yourself over so we could talk.
I'll do it anytime.
Okay.
Thanks, Stephen.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Keep Talking. If you are finding value in this podcast, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/keeptalkingpodcast. I truly appreciate all of you who are supporting the show.